73 years ago, a 6-year-old boy vanished from a neighborhood park in Oakland, California, gone without a sound, without a trace. His brother, just 10 years old, swore he'd seen a woman in a green scarf lead him away. But the police didn't believe him. They called it an accident, a drowning, even when no body was ever found. For decades, a mother begged for answers, walking to the station year after year with a photograph of her missing son. Her faith never wavered, but the world forgot. Then, 70 years later, a single DNA test, taken for fun, uncovered a truth no one could have imagined. Before we dive into this unbelievable true story of loss, faith, and science breaking silence, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you love stories of mysteries finally solved, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. Oakland, California, 1951. A quiet afternoon draped in sunlight over a worn-down neighborhood. Two boys laughing in a park they'd played in 100 times before, their voices carrying across the cracked pavement and rusted swings. But within minutes, everything changed. One boy turned around, and the other was simply gone. No cry for help, no sound, just the echo of laughter fading into the still air. Search parties swept through the blocks, police scoured the waterfront and the rail yards. Mothers called into the night until their voices broke. But the child had vanished, leaving behind only silence and questions that no one could answer. Days became weeks. Weeks turned into years. And for 70 long years, the mystery lay buried, until the truth finally began to claw its way to the surface. A year before that terrible day, in the summer of 1950, a young mother arrived in California on a crowded train, 6 children huddled close behind her. Her name was Antonia Albino. She had left Puerto Rico with nothing but hope, chasing a dream whispered across the ocean. The promise that hard work in America might build a better life for her family. The West she found was not golden, but gray. Soot-stained streets and endless noise. Yet Antonia was unyielding. She carried no money, no husband, only determination and the quiet fire of a woman who refused to give in. Her new home stood on Brush Street in West Oakland, a narrow house with thin walls and a leaky roof, wedged between rail lines and factories. The neighborhood had swelled during the war, filled with workers who'd built ships for victory. But by the 50s, the war was over, and so was the prosperity. What remained were weary families, cheap beer, and the constant hum of freight trains cutting through restless nights. To outsiders, Oakland was still booming. To those inside its heart, it was survival. One day at a time. Antonia rose before dawn, picking fruit in distant orchards, her hands raw and bleeding by sunset. At night, she sat beneath a flickering lamp, stitching gloves for pennies, the sound of her needle the only rhythm in the small, crowded house. The children slept close together on worn blankets, their mother's quiet humming the last sound before sleep. She bore the strength of 2 parents, her back bent by labor, but her will unbroken. In a world built to grind her down, she became the foundation, the only thing holding her family together. Her youngest, 6-year-old Luis, was the heartbeat of that home. A boy with wide brown eyes and a grin that could melt even the hardest heart. Neighbors remembered him darting between houses, barefoot and curious, asking endless questions about trains, ships, and the world beyond their street. He was too young to understand fear, too young to doubt that good things lasted. His closest companion was his 10-year-old brother Roger, quiet, serious, already learning to carry the burden of being the man of the house. Roger watched over Luis like a shadow, guiding him through the neighborhood's chaos. But even Roger couldn't protect him from what was coming, from the day that would rip their family apart forever. Where Luis was carefree, Roger was cautious, the kind of child who already carried the weight of responsibility on his small shoulders. While Luis chased butterflies and marbles, Roger was the translator, the helper, the quiet shield standing between his mother and the outside world. He was 10, but already more man than boy, learning early that survival demanded vigilance. When Antonia spoke to landlords or employers who didn't understand her Spanish, it was Roger who found the words in English, his voice steady beyond his years. Luis adored him, followed him like a shadow, mimicking his stride, copying his laugh, trusting that as long as Roger was near, nothing bad could ever touch him. Inside the Albino household, life was loud and full. 6 children packed into a tiny house meant noise that never seemed to end. The rattle of dishes, the shuffle of bare feet across the floor, the shrill laughter and sudden tears that only siblings can produce. The chaos could drive anyone to exhaustion, but it was alive with love. Messy, imperfect, but real. Antonia ruled it all with both tenderness and steel. She was firm, a mother who demanded respect and obedience. Yet her strength came from love, not anger. Every Sunday she marched her children to church, their mismatched clothes freshly washed and pressed as best she could manage. She wanted them to believe that dignity was not something the world gave you. It was something you carried, no matter how poor you were. But beneath Antonia's strength lived a quiet, relentless fear. She had seen too much of what the world could do to the unprotected. Her fingers clutched her rosary whenever word spread of trouble, a fight on the corner, a missing child, another body pulled from the bay. "Stay close," she would tell them, her voice sharp with worry. "Don't talk to strangers, don't wander too far." Her children didn't always understand the reason behind the warnings, but they felt the weight of them. They knew safety in West Oakland was never guaranteed. In the early 1950s, West Oakland was alive with sound and struggle. The war years had brought thousands to its factories and shipyards. African-American families from the South, immigrants from Mexico, Puerto Rico, the Philippines. Cultures mixed on the same cracked sidewalks, gospel music echoing from one porch, Spanish from the next. But behind that vitality lay decay. The city's promises rarely reached the working poor. Schools were underfunded, the streets dim and broken, and the police, when they came at all, inspired more fear than comfort. For families like the Albinos, survival meant carving out small moments of peace wherever they could find them. For Roger and Luis, that peace lived in Jefferson Square Park, a patch of worn grass and rusted swings just a few blocks away. It wasn't much, but to them, it was everything. The slide became a mountain, the sandbox, a battlefield, the trees, their castle walls. There, they could laugh without restraint, breathe without worry, and for a few fleeting hours, forget how small their world really was. Roger watched over his little brother from the swings, calling out warnings and reminders in the way big brothers do. And Luis, ever fearless, would grin back, confident that nothing could go wrong, not with Roger nearby. But in West Oakland, innocence was fragile. It could disappear as easily as a gust of wind sweeping down Brush Street. And Antonia, standing in her kitchen as the light faded that afternoon, must have felt it in her bones. That uneasy stirring in a mother's heart, the silent intuition that sometimes even love isn't enough to keep danger from finding your child. Antonia carried her fear like a shadow, silent, constant, woven into every breath she took. She never spoke it aloud, but it showed in the tension at the corners of her mouth, in the way her eyes followed her children until they disappeared down the block, and in the quiet prayers she whispered over their sleeping forms each night. By February of 1951, life in the Albino household had settled into a fragile rhythm. It wasn't easy, but it was theirs. Antonia worked. The children went to school, and every afternoon, the brothers escaped to the small park that had become their world. Luis still lived in that golden haze of childhood, unburdened by fear. Roger, older now, carried the invisible weight of responsibility, and Antonia, unbreakable, exhausted, hopeful, was the anchor holding them all together. No one could have imagined how quickly that balance would crumble. or that the joy of a single afternoon would turn into a wound that never healed. The afternoon of February 21st began like any other. Oakland sat beneath a heavy gray sky, the kind that pressed low over rooftops and made the world feel smaller. The air was cool, and the children's breath fogged faintly as they ran across Jefferson Square Park. Roger, 10 years old and protective as ever, led the way. Luis, 6, followed close behind, his red sweater flashing between the swings and the slide. The park echoed with laughter, the metallic creak of chains, the thud of sneakers hitting packed dirt, the ordinary music of childhood. For a while, it was peace. But in the space between one heartbeat and the next, that peace was gone. When Roger looked up again, his brother wasn't there. The swing was empty, still swaying gently in the wind. His stomach tightened. He spun around, calling Luis's name, scanning every corner of the park. Nothing. Then, from the far edge of the playground, he saw movement. A woman, unfamiliar, speaking softly to Luis. And then, they were walking away together. For a moment, Roger froze. Something deep inside him, something older than his years, told him this was wrong. Then panic exploded through him. He ran. Down Brush Street, across cracked sidewalks, his lungs burning, his small hands pumping through the cold air. He burst through the door of the crowded albino home, gasping, his voice breaking between English and Spanish. "Mama, Luis, he went. A woman. She talked to him. He followed her." The room fell silent. Antonia's face went pale. Her hands, still dusted with flour, began to tremble. "What woman?" she demanded. "Where?" Roger's words tumbled out between sobs. She was tall, maybe with dark hair. She smiled, said something he couldn't hear, and Luis went with her. The reaction was instant. Neighbors dropped what they were doing. Chairs scraped against the floor. Coats were thrown on shoulders. Antonia rushed out first, her heart pounding. A mother's fear consuming reason. Roger ran ahead, pointing, shouting, "This way! She took him this way!" They sprinted through the streets, calling Luis's name, their voices echoing off brick walls and empty lots. When they reached Jefferson Square, Roger pointed frantically toward the swings, the slide, the patch of dirt where his brother had been moments before. But there was nothing. No sign of Luis. Just the sound of the wind through the trees, and a silence so heavy, it felt like the world itself had stopped breathing. The swings swayed in the wind, creaking softly, as if the ghost of a child still played there. The metal slide glimmered under the dull afternoon sky, catching the faintest hint of light. But Luis was gone. Antonia's voice tore through the still air, raw and frantic, echoing down the narrow streets. "Luis, mi hijo!" Her cries rang across the block, carried on the wind like a prayer and a warning. Neighbors rushed from their porches, drawn by the sound of a mother's terror. They searched behind fences, through alleys, near the freight tracks that bordered the park. Roger shouted until his throat burned, his small body shaking. He had done what he thought was right, run home for help, but somehow he had been too late. The panic spread quickly through Brush Street. Doors swung open, faces appeared in windows, and soon the neighborhood pulsed with urgency. "A boy's missing," someone shouted. "A woman took him." Fear crackled in the air, sharp and contagious. West Oakland had seen hardship before, poverty, crime, injustice. But the disappearance of a child was different. It cut deeper. It made every parent clutch their own a little tighter that night. By the time the police arrived, chaos had taken hold. The small park was crowded with anxious neighbors pointing in every direction. Antonia stood trembling, clutching the arm of a woman who tried to translate her desperate words into English. Roger, pale and tear-streaked, faced the officers alone. He told them everything. About the woman, maybe 30 years old, wearing a scarf over her hair. She'd spoken Spanish, kind words, promised Luis candy, taken his hand, and walked away. He had run for help, but when he returned, they were gone. The officers listened, pens scratching on notepads, but doubt clouded their faces. "Can you describe her better?" they pressed. "Which way did she go? Are you sure?" Roger's answers wavered, tangled in panic. He was just 10, scared, shaking, desperate to make them believe. But his story came out in fragments, and to the officers, fragments weren't enough. Skepticism hardened. Maybe he'd been mistaken. Maybe the boy had wandered off. The bay wasn't far, and every year the tide claimed children who strayed too close to the water's edge. It was easier, more comfortable, to believe in an accident than in the dark possibility of abduction. So, that's what they wrote down. Luis Albino, presumed drowned. The Coast Guard was called in. Boats swept the gray waters of Jack London Square. Searchlights sliced through the fog. Divers dropped into the cold depths, and nets dragged the shoreline. For days they searched. Nothing. No shoe, no scrap of clothing, no trace. Just the endless, indifferent water. Antonia refused to accept it. She had seen Roger's eyes, wide, terrified, certain. Her son hadn't imagined it. He had seen the woman. Luis had been taken. But when Antonia tried to make the police understand, her Spanish tumbled out in frantic bursts that lost their power in translation. The words reached them, but the meaning, the grief, the conviction, never did. Her pleas became background noise in a case they'd already decided was closed. And so, the file went cold. The officers moved on. But inside the small house on Brush Street, time stopped. The laughter was gone. The table felt emptier than ever. Luis's chair remained untouched, a silent reminder of everything they'd lost. The air hung heavy with absence, and, though life would continue, nothing in that home would ever truly be the same again. Every evening, Antonia stood by the doorway, her silhouette framed by the dim light of the street lamps, waiting, as if sheer will could bring her boy home. She would glance toward the park, toward the railroad tracks, toward the shadows, whispering his name under her breath. Inside, the house on Brush Street grew quieter. The noise that had once filled it, the teasing, the laughter, the small scuffles of childhood, faded into an uneasy hush. The remaining children played less, spoke softer, and moved carefully through the rooms, as though afraid to disturb the emptiness Luis had left behind. And Roger, poor Roger, carried the heaviest weight of all. He was only 10, but his heart bore the guilt of a lifetime. He had seen. He had run. He had done everything a frightened child could do. Yet when he returned, his brother was gone. That single moment became the anchor that chained him to grief. Again and again, he replayed it. The sound of the swing creaking, the sight of the woman's scarf, the cold air filling his lungs as he ran home. He told himself he should have held Luis's hand tighter, should have shouted louder, should have stayed. Those thoughts became his prayer and his punishment, whispered for years in the dark when no one else could hear. The disappearance didn't end at the park that day. It seeped into everything, into the rhythm of meals, the silence of prayers, the way Antonia's eyes lingered on an empty chair at the table. It haunted the family's every gesture, every glance toward Jefferson Square, where the empty swing still swayed in the wind like a cruel reminder. A little boy had vanished. A mother had lost her heartbeat. A brother had lost his shadow. And a family had been thrown into a story that would stretch across 73 long, aching years. The days after Luis's disappearance blurred together in a fog of exhaustion and dread. The house no longer echoed with the chaos of children. Even their fights seemed muted, as though the air itself had forgotten how to carry joy. Antonia could not rest. She refused to. Before dawn, when the fog still clung to the bay, she rose and began her search. Her body ached from the fields, her hands rough from stitching gloves through the night. But none of it mattered. A mother's need to find her child burned hotter than pain or hunger. Each morning she walked to the police station, sometimes with Roger, sometimes with one of the older children, sometimes with a neighbor who could translate her broken English into something the officers might understand. Her Spanish poured out in frantic waves, each word soaked in desperation. Mi hijo fue llevado. No se ahogó. Por favor, encuéntrenlo. My son was taken. He didn't drown. Please, find him. But the officers, unmoved, repeated the same lines. The bay had been searched. Accidents happen. Without evidence, there was nothing more they could do. Every time she left, her shoulders bent a little lower, her steps a little slower. Still, she returned, day after day, week after week, month after month. Eventually, the visits came only once a year, yet she never stopped. The clerks came to recognize her, the immigrant mother with tired eyes, clutching a faded photograph of a smiling boy frozen forever at 6 years old. They pitied her persistence but didn't share her hope. To them, it was a closed case. To her, it was an open wound that would never heal. And for Roger, that wound only deepened with time. Roger had been the one to see, the one to run, the one who came back too late. At 10 years old, he'd done exactly what adults always tell children to do. Find help, get a grown-up. But logic was no match for guilt. In his heart, he believed he'd failed his brother. He should have stayed. He should have shouted louder. He should have held Luis's hand and never let go. That thought burrowed deep inside him, hardening over the years into a scar that never stopped aching. In the months that followed, Roger grew quieter. His laughter, once easy and contagious, became something rare, a sound you'd miss if you blinked. At school, he avoided the park, couldn't stand the sight of the swings or the slide that still glimmered under the Oakland sun. When classmates asked about his brother, he'd shake his head, mutter something, and walk away. At home, he spent hours by the window, staring out at the street as if waiting for Luis to come walking back, small and smiling, asking what was for dinner. Each time Antonia asked him to retell the story to the police, his voice trembled a little more. What had once been a memory became something heavier, a confession, rehearsed and relived until it began to feel like penance. The other children bore the loss in their own ways. Some grew angry, frustrated that no one had answers. Others stayed silent, afraid that even speaking Luis's name might reopen the wound. Yet no one could escape the emptiness. At mealtimes, the chair he'd once occupied sat untouched, like a ghost among them. On birthdays, an extra candle was lit, and never blown out. And on Christmas morning, when gifts were exchanged, someone would whisper his name, a quiet hope sent out into the cold, that maybe, somehow, he was still alive. Antonia's grief was relentless. It burned not as weakness, but as strength. Neighbors saw her year after year, marching to the police station with that same worn photograph in her hand. They heard her prayers whispered late at night, the sound of rosary beads clicking softly in the dark. They watched her grow thinner, her hair turning silver too soon, her back bending slightly under the weight of both labor and loss. Yet she never surrendered to despair. She refused to give up, one neighbor would later say. Even when no one else believed, she did. But grief, always, demands a price. The lines on her face deepened, etched not just by time, but by longing. Her body aged faster than her years, and though her faith in God kept her moving, her eyes always carried the shadow of what had been lost. Decades passed. Oakland changed around them. The freeways came first, vast concrete rivers that cut through West Oakland, slicing neighborhoods apart, scattering families who had once lived side by side. The factories that had once roared with work fell silent, replaced by boarded-up windows and the hum of passing traffic. Jobs disappeared. Crime rose. The old community spirit began to fade. But for the Albino family, time stood still. Their lives remained anchored to a single moment in February 1951. The afternoon Roger ran for help and came back to a world forever changed. By the 1960s, Luis would have been a young man. Antonia refused to believe he was gone. "He will come back," she told her children with conviction. "He's out there somewhere." In her mind, she built entire futures for him. Maybe he'd joined the army, or found work as a mechanic, or started a family of his own. She imagined him one day standing at her door, older but smiling, saying the words she'd prayed to hear for decades. "Mama, I'm home." Those dreams were what kept her alive when faith and evidence had long since parted ways. Roger, now grown, carried his guilt like a shadow into adulthood. He married, had children of his own, worked steady jobs, and built the quiet life his mother had always wanted for them. But no amount of normalcy could erase the memory of that day in the park. Sometimes, when the world went still, he'd find himself back there, the gray sky above, the creak of the swings, the sound of Luis's laughter fading into the wind. Those who knew Roger described him as a man marked by quiet sorrow, a seriousness that seemed to follow him everywhere, like a shadow he couldn't shake. He smiled when life required it, but the light never quite reached his eyes. He avoided talking about the park. He avoided memories of childhood altogether. And when he did speak of Luis, his voice would catch, the words heavy, each one dragged through decades of regret. He never forgave himself for running that day. Logic told him he'd done what any frightened child should have done. His heart told him he'd failed his brother forever. The albino household moved forward because life demanded it. Bills still came. Children still needed feeding, teaching, comforting. The world outside didn't stop for grief. Yet every joy that touched the family was shadowed by absence. Weddings carried a quiet ache. Birthdays felt incomplete. Each new child was met with both love and the reminder that one had been lost. Even their laughter, when it returned, seemed softer, careful not to echo too loudly, as if joy itself might feel guilty for existing. For Antonia, the hardest part wasn't death. It was not knowing. Death could be faced, named, buried. But absence, that was endless. It lived in the space between prayers, in the stillness after midnight. She clung to Roger's words as gospel. A woman took him. Year after year, she repeated it. "He's alive somewhere, I know it." Neighbors pitied her. Some called it denial, others madness. But to Antonia, surrendering meant killing her son twice, once to the loss, and again to disbelief. So she held on. Even as the world turned without her, she refused to let go of that thread of hope. By the time Antonia passed away in 2005, she had carried that hope for over half a century. Her children gathered around her coffin knowing that she had died, still asking the same question that had haunted her since 1951. Where is Luis? That question didn't die with her. It lived on, passed quietly from one generation to the next, woven into the family's very identity. Luis was not just the boy who vanished. He was the silence that shaped them all. The ghost at every meal. The empty space in every photograph. The story that refused to end. Outside their small circle, the world had long forgotten. His name was buried in old police reports and dusty archives of the Oakland Police Department. But for the albino family, February 21st, 1951 was never history. It was the present, frozen in time, a wound that never healed, a silence that never broke. By the mid-1960s, 15 years had passed since that gray afternoon at Jefferson Square Park. The world beyond Brush Street had changed completely. Elvis had risen and fallen. Presidents had come and gone. Wars raged in jungles halfway around the world. But for the albinos, nothing truly moved forward. In their memories, Luis remained 6 years old, smiling in a faded photo, forever young. His voice lived only in the whispers shared late at night when someone would ask, "Do you ever dream of him?" And yet, somehow, even after all those years, hope endured. Fragile, unreasonable, but alive. Because love, even broken, even buried, never truly fades. By 1966, Luis would have been 21, the age when every young man in America was registered for military service. For the Albino family, that milestone sparked a fragile flicker of hope. Maybe, they thought, if Luis had somehow survived, if he'd grown up under another name, in another place, the government's records might hold his trace. Somewhere among the draft boards and enlistment lists, perhaps his name would appear, quietly confirming that he was still out there. So they searched. Roger, now a young man himself, carried the same guilt that had shadowed him since childhood, but he threw it into action. He wrote letters, visited offices, stood in long lines under humming fluorescent lights, explaining again and again that he was looking for his brother, missing since 1951, maybe living under a different identity. Clerks handed him forms, suggested agencies, offered polite sympathy, but the answers were always the same. There was no record, no enlistment, no trace. The files gave them nothing, just another kind of silence, cold and bureaucratic. For Antonia, that search had been more than an inquiry. It was a lifeline. Each letter mailed, each name checked, had been a prayer disguised as paperwork. When the effort collapsed, when even the government's ledgers came up empty, it left her both more determined and more alone. The world had moved on, and her grief had grown old in its eyes. But she refused to let the matter rest. She couldn't. When America's systems failed her, Antonia turned her gaze back across the sea, to Puerto Rico, the island that had given her both life and loss. Maybe, she thought, Luis had been taken back there. Maybe the woman had brought him home under a false name. And so, more than once, Antonia and her older children boarded a plane to San Juan, carrying with them the same faded photograph, the one of Luis smiling, 6 years old, hair neatly combed, eyes bright with trust. They walked through villages and city streets, showing the picture to anyone who would look. "Have you seen this boy?" they asked, in Spanish tinged with hope and exhaustion. "Did anyone come here years ago with a child like this?" Some people shook their heads with sympathy. Others waved them away, tired of old ghosts. Each time, Antonia returned to Oakland with less strength, but never less faith. The boy in the photograph had become timeless, the child who refused to grow old, the mystery that refused to fade. The years piled on. Antonia's hair turned white, her back bent. Her visits to the police station dwindled to once a year. She still carried that same worn photograph in her handbag, the corners creased, the image nearly rubbed away by time and touch. The younger officers no longer knew what to tell her. They smiled kindly, promised to look into it, and filed the same report back into a cabinet already thick with dust. Roger, now middle-aged, carried the weight differently. Outwardly, he built a steady life, a job, a family, a routine. But inside, the guilt never eased. Every new search, every false lead reopened the wound. He could still see that gray sky over Jefferson Square, still hear the creak of the swings, still feel his brother's absence like a missing limb. No matter how many years passed, he remained the boy who had seen, who had run, who had come back too late. The other siblings learned to live around the emptiness. Some spoke of Luis softly, keeping his memory alive in stories. Others buried it deep, afraid that saying his name would only bring back pain. But whether they spoke or stayed silent, the truth was the same. He was never really gone. His absence lingered, shaping their lives in quiet, invisible ways, like a shadow that time itself couldn't erase. Some of the albino siblings tried to bury the past, refusing to let grief rule their lives. Others refused to let time erase him. They spoke Luis's name at every family gathering, setting an extra plate at the table, keeping his photograph near the altar. Whether spoken aloud or left unmentioned, his presence lingered. The missing piece in every celebration, the shadow behind every smile, the invisible thread that tied generations together. As the decades turned, Oakland itself changed beyond recognition. The freeways came first, roaring rivers of concrete that sliced through once close neighborhoods. Families were displaced. The small homes of West Oakland, once filled with dock workers and dreamers, gave way to silence and decay. Factories closed. Jobs vanished. Crime crept in where opportunity had lived. But for the Albino family, these changes were little more than background noise. Their world had stopped moving in 1951, anchored forever to a single February afternoon when a 6-year-old boy vanished without a sound. By the 1980s and 1990s, hope had grown thin, worn at the edges but not yet extinguished. Technology was advancing. DNA testing was beginning to reshape law enforcement, but it was still far beyond the reach of ordinary families. For the Albinos, the only tool they had was faith, and Antonia clung to hers with the fierceness of a mother who refused to surrender. Every night she knelt by her bed, fingers wrapped around her rosary, whispering her son's name into the dark. "He is alive," she told her children again and again. "Somewhere, he is alive." But time is merciless, even to faith. In 2005, Antonia's long journey came to an end. She had lived more than half a century without answers, carrying that same photograph, creased and faded, edges soft from decades of touch. Her children buried her with it, knowing she had gone to her grave still asking the same question that had haunted her since that gray afternoon in Jefferson Square Park. Where is Luis? Her death broke something inside the family. For the siblings, it felt like the last thread had snapped. The woman who had carried the flame for so long was gone, and with her went the voice that had refused to let hope die. Roger, already burdened by guilt, now carried the weight of two ghosts, his brother and his mother, pressing against his heart. By then, Luis had been missing for over 50 years. To the city of Oakland, the case was long forgotten. The police files sat buried in archives, the paper yellowed, the ink fading. To the newspapers, it was ancient history, one more story swallowed by time. But to the Albino family, it was still alive. The wound had never closed. The story had never ended. Every new child born into the family grew up hearing it. The tale of the uncle who vanished, the grandmother who searched until her final breath, the brother who never forgave himself. The loss became part of their bloodline, shaping how they saw the world. Family marked not by tragedy alone, but by love that refused to fade. And then, at last, in the 21st century, something changed. A new kind of tool emerged, one that neither Antonia nor Roger could have imagined. A tool powerful enough to pierce decades of silence, to bring the lost and the searching face to face again. For nearly 3/4 of a century, the disappearance of Luis Armando Albino existed as both a wound and a whisper, the story of a child gone missing, a mother who never stopped believing, and a family who lived suspended between hope and heartbreak. But what no one could have predicted was that, after 70 years, the truth would finally begin to surface, not through witnesses or police work, but through science. To the outside world, Luis was little more than a name buried in a forgotten case file, one among countless cold cases that had long slipped beneath the tide of time. But to his family, he was never gone. He was a shadow that lingered in the corners of every photograph, a missing voice at every gathering, a story too painful to end and too sacred to forget. By the early 2000s, the case was as cold as any could be. There were no new witnesses to question, no suspects left alive, no trace of evidence that modern forensics could test. For decades, the only thread law enforcement had ever possessed was Roger's trembling childhood memory, a woman with a scarf, a promise of candy, a boy who followed and never returned. It was the kind of detail skeptics dismissed, the kind of story a grieving mother repeated until it hardened into myth. And yet, beneath that myth, the truth still waited. Then, in the most ordinary and, extraordinary way imaginable. The silence finally broke. In 2020, one of Luis's nieces, a woman named Alita Alcuin, decided to take a consumer DNA test. She wasn't thinking about the disappearance or about the ghost her family had carried for 70 years. Like millions of others, she was simply curious. Companies like Ancestry and 23andMe had turned genetics into genealogy. A simple vial of saliva mailed off in exchange for colorful charts, percentages, and distant relatives scattered across the globe. For Alita, it was about roots, about understanding where her Puerto Rican family came from, how their story stretched across oceans and generations. She sent off the kit, waited the usual few weeks, and thought little more of it. But when the results finally arrived, buried among the expected names and familiar branches of her family tree, one match stopped her cold. A man she didn't recognize. The system flagged him as a close relative, roughly a 22% DNA match. That was the range for an uncle. Her breath caught. Her family didn't have any living uncles she didn't already know, except one. The one who had disappeared before she was born. The one her grandmother had prayed for every night until the day she died. The one her father could never talk about without his voice breaking. Luis. Her pulse raced as she stared at the name, the small photo attached to the profile. An older man now, living far away. It didn't make sense, and yet somehow it made perfect sense. Could this be him? Could a simple algorithm, lines of code and percentages, have done what detectives, divers, and decades of searching could not? Heart pounding, Alita crafted a message. She kept it respectful, cautious, hopeful. She explained who she was, mentioned her family, and gently shared the DNA connection. Her fingers trembled as she pressed send. Then she waited. Days turned into weeks. Each time her phone buzzed, her heart leapt and sank again. No response. Maybe he hadn't seen it. Maybe he thought it was spam. Or maybe, just maybe, he knew exactly what it meant and wasn't ready to face it. After a while, life crept back in. Work, children, responsibilities. And the unanswered message faded quietly into the background. But the thought never left her. Somewhere out there, she believed, the truth still waited, hidden not in police archives or faded newspapers, but in the code of her own DNA. The thought never really left her. It hovered at the edges of Alita's mind like a whisper she couldn't silence. Every time she looked at her family, her daughters laughing in the kitchen, her father lost in thought, it echoed again. What if Lou is alive? What if he's been out there all along? By early 2024, that whisper had become impossible to ignore. The weight of 70 years of unanswered questions pressed heavier than ever. Alita thought of her grandmother, Antonia, who had walked to the police station year after year, clutching a photograph of her missing boy. She thought of her Uncle Roger, who had carried guilt through a lifetime, replaying the same few minutes of childhood again and again. And she thought of her own daughters, a generation growing up in a world where a strand of DNA could do what detectives once could not. If her family had carried Luis's story this far, how could she let it fade now? One night, while watching a true crime documentary, something shifted. The program told of another family who had solved a disappearance decades old, not through police work, but through the very same DNA services. As the credits rolled, Alita sat frozen, realization washing over her. We have the match, she thought. We have the proof. The rest is up to us. Renewed with purpose, she began digging again. She scoured online databases, searching for any trace of the man whose DNA had connected to hers. And then she found photographs. Old, modest snapshots, the kind people post without much thought. But when Alita saw his face, her breath caught in her throat. The resemblance was undeniable. The same sharp jawline she'd seen in the faded photo from 1951. The same eyes, Antonia's eyes, staring back across 70 years. That's him, she whispered. It has to be him. Driven by certainty, Alita went further. She visited the Oakland Public Library, scrolling through reels of yellowed microfilm until she found it. A 1951 newspaper clipping, grainy and faded, showing two boys side by side under the headline, "Missing Child." Luis and Roger. She held the image up next to the modern photograph on her phone. The echo between the faces was haunting. The same bone structure, the same expression. It was as though time had folded in on itself. Armed with DNA reports, photographs, and 70 years of persistence, Alita walked into the Oakland Police Department. The same building her grandmother had once entered with nothing but a mother's faith. This time, the air was different. The world had changed. And now, for the first time, someone listened. The old file was pulled from storage. Brittle, yellowed, forgotten. The case that had lain dormant for generations was suddenly alive again. The FBI and the California Department of Justice were brought in. And soon, federal agents boarded a plane headed east, tracking down the man whose name and DNA had reignited a 70-year mystery. When they found him, he was living quietly, a retired firefighter, a decorated Marine Corps veteran who had served 2 tours in Vietnam. He had built a life, a family, children, grandchildren. To him, he was simply who he'd always been, the son of the couple who raised him, a man with a full past, and no reason to question it. The idea that he might once have been a missing child from Oakland, California, seemed impossible. But then the agents showed him the photographs, the documents, the DNA results. The resemblance was there, the boy in the black and white photo and the man sitting before them. They asked if he would provide a DNA sample of his own. He agreed. Weeks later, the results arrived. The match was absolute. There was no mistake. The man was Luis Armando Albino. For the Albino family, the confirmation landed like a thunderclap. After 73 long years, the impossible had become real. The boy they had mourned, the boy Antonia had begged the police to find, the boy Roger had never forgiven himself for losing. He was alive. But the revelation came with a bittersweet weight. Luis had not grown up surrounded by the family who had loved and searched for him. Instead, he had been raised by strangers on the East Coast, unaware that his entire life had been built on the foundation of a lie. He had served in the Marine Corps, fighting through the jungles of Vietnam, facing fire and chaos half a world away. He returned home to serve again, this time as a firefighter, a man who risked his life for others, never knowing that he had once been the child no one could save. He built a life filled with honor and love, a wife, children, grandchildren. A lifetime of birthdays, holidays, and family milestones. But beneath all of it lay a silence he could never quite explain. He remembered flashes from early childhood, long train rides, unfamiliar faces, a woman's hand guiding him somewhere he didn't belong. When he asked about those memories, the answers were vague, brushed away with soft lies and half-truths. He never realized those silences were hiding something far darker, the truth of a kidnapping. For his siblings, the discovery was both joy and heartbreak. Joy, because Luis had survived. Heartbreak, because their mother, Antonia, had died nearly 20 years earlier, never knowing that her prayers had been answered. She had walked to the police station year after year, begging officers to listen, clutching her son's photograph until the ink began to fade. And though she never saw him again in life, her faith had been justified in death. When Roger, now an old man, heard the news, his hands trembled. For 73 years, he had carried guilt heavier than any child should bear. He had lived with the belief that he had failed his brother, that his choice to run for help had cost Luis his life. But now, at last, the truth set him free. His memory had been right all along. Luis had been taken. The woman in the scarf was real, and the world had simply refused to believe a 10-year-old boy. The confirmation vindicated a lifetime of persistence. Antonia had been right. Roger had been right. The Albino family's pain had not been in vain. Yet with the truth came new questions, haunting ones that may never be answered. Who was the woman in the park? Why had she taken Luis? Was it an act of desperation, a crime born from grief, or part of something larger, perhaps a black market adoption, as some whispered? Did the couple who raised him know he had been stolen, or had they too been deceived? Those answers are likely lost forever. The woman with the scarf is almost certainly long dead. The couple who raised Luis are gone. The paper trail has faded, the witnesses silenced by time, the memories blurred. The truth, in full, may never surface. But for the Albino family, one truth mattered above all. Luis had lived. He had survived. When the FBI delivered the confirmation in June of 2024, the case of Luis Armando Albino was no longer just a story of loss. It had become a story of survival, of faith, of science breaking through 73 years of silence. A simple DNA test, taken for curiosity, had achieved what generations of detectives could not. For Alida, the moment was overwhelming. She had grown up hearing her grandmother's story like a family legend, a wound passed down through whispers. And now, she had helped to close it. When she finally spoke to her uncle, the man once lost, now found, her words were simple, trembling with emotion yet carrying the weight of decades. "Thank you," she said softly. "Thank you for letting us find you." The breakthrough wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of its final act. In June of 2024, Luis Armando Albino boarded a plane bound for California, the state where his life had begun and been stolen in the same breath. He carried a small overnight bag, though what he brought with him was far heavier. 73 years of unspoken history. When the plane touched down at Oakland International Airport, an elderly man stepped out into the morning light. His gait was steady, though time had bowed his shoulders slightly. His dark eyes scanned the terminal, alert, uncertain, searching. To the passengers around him, he was just another traveler. But to the family waiting beyond the gate, he was a miracle. 73 years earlier, a 6-year-old boy had vanished from a park in West Oakland, led away by a woman in a scarf. Now, at 80 years old, that same boy was returning, not as a victim, but as a grandfather, a veteran, a retired firefighter, and a survivor of a stolen life. Waiting beyond the security line was a cluster of faces he had never seen, but somehow already knew. Nieces, nephews, great-nieces, cousins. Generations born from the family that had never stopped whispering his name. They held signs and photographs, tears glistening under the terminal lights. Among them stood Alida, the niece who had refused to let her grandmother's prayers fade into silence. When their eyes met, she felt her heart stutter. For months, she had imagined this moment, the reunion, the words, the weight of it all. But when she finally stepped forward, her voice faltered into a trembling whisper. "Thank you for letting us find you." Luis's eyes softened. He reached for her with hands roughened by years of fire and labor and pulled her into an embrace. His voice was low, gravelly, thick with emotion. "No," he said. "Thank you for finding me." Around them, the family wept openly. Strangers paused mid-step, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. An old man returning not just to a place, but to a past thought lost forever. But the true weight of the moment waited beyond the airport. At a small house in Oakland, Roger, now 83, frail but lucid, sat in his chair, waiting. The same brother who had once raced home, breathless and terrified, was now an old man, worn thin by the guilt he had carried for a lifetime. When the door opened and Luis stepped inside, time seemed to bend. Roger's hands trembled. His voice cracked on the first syllable. "Luis!" Luis crossed the room. The brothers locked eyes. Two lives split apart and reunited by fate's strange mercy. For a moment, silence filled the air. Then Roger pushed himself up, his body shaking, and reached for his brother. The two men collapsed into each other's arms, a fierce, wordless embrace that seemed to fold decades of pain into a single, overwhelming moment. Roger wept, his face pressed against Luis's shoulder, sobs breaking loose from a place that had been locked since childhood. Luis held him tightly, his own tears falling freely, his hand patting Roger's back with the instinctive gentleness of family rediscovered. They hugged, Alida would later say, her voice trembling. But it wasn't just a hug. It was history. It was 73 years of everything that had been lost and everything that had been found in one embrace. For hours, the two brothers sat side by side, speaking softly, as if afraid to break the fragile miracle that had reunited them. They talked about their childhood, the fragments each remembered, hazy and incomplete, and about the lives they'd lived apart. Roger confessed the guilt he had carried for 73 long years, the weight that had bent his spirit, but never broken it. Luis listened quietly, then reached over and placed a calloused hand on his brother's arm. "You were only a boy," he said gently. "You did what you could." Those 5 words lifted something that had lived inside Roger for a lifetime. For the first time since 1951, he allowed himself to believe that the burden had never truly been his to bear. The reunion rippled far beyond the brothers. Luis met sisters who had prayed for him, nieces and nephews who had grown up on the legend of his disappearance, and great-nieces and nephews who were just now realizing that their family story, the one whispered at every gathering, was real. He listened as they told him about Antonia's devotion, the countless trips to the police station, the prayers murmured in Spanish each night, the decades she spent believing against all odds that her little boy was alive somewhere in the world. When they told him that she had passed in 2005, Luis bowed his head. Tears streaked his weathered cheeks. "She never stopped looking," he whispered, "and I never knew." They showed him the old newspaper clipping, a grainy black-and-white photograph of 2 boys standing side by side, printed the day after he vanished. Luis held it in his hands for a long time, tracing the faded outlines with his thumb as though trying to connect with the child he had once been. His voice was soft when he finally spoke. "That was me," he said, wonder in every syllable. "That was me all along." But joy is never simple when it arrives so late. Roger's health had been failing, his body already tired from age and years of quiet sorrow. 2 months after that long-awaited embrace, he passed away. Yet those who loved him believed he died at peace, the peace he had been denied for most of his life. "I think he died happy," Alida said later. For 73 years he carried guilt, and in the end, he got to hold his brother again. He got to know he hadn't failed. He got to see the truth with his own eyes. For Luis, the reunion carried its own bittersweet edge. He had been given back his family, only to lose his brother again in a matter of weeks. Yet, in those brief days together, something profound took place. The hug, the conversations, the forgiveness, they were enough to bridge 7 decades of silence, enough to heal the wound that had defined generations. For the Albino family, the reunion became more than personal. It became a testament, proof that the persistence of love can outlast time itself. That memory, carried faithfully through generations, can survive even when everything else fades, and that modern science, cold and clinical as it seems, can sometimes serve as the hand of destiny. Neighbors wept when they heard the story. Journalists called it a miracle. One reporter wrote, 73 years, longer than most lifetimes, yet love, memory, and science conspired to give this family the ending they were denied. But for Luis, the ending was still unfolding. He had lived 8 decades believing one story about who he was, and now he was being asked to accept another. The parents who had raised him were not his parents. The siblings he thought he'd never had were now standing before him, weeping, welcoming him home. The truth was staggering, but as he looked around the room, surrounded by faces that carried echoes of his own, Luis understood something profound. He hadn't just been found. He had been returned. The life Luis might have had in Oakland, the birthdays, the milestones, the chance to grow up beneath Antonia's roof, had been stolen from him long ago. And yet, he refused to let bitterness claim what was left. "I lived a good life," he told his family softly. "I served my country. I raised children. I have grandchildren. I lost something precious, yes, but I also gained. I can't change the past, but I can be grateful for the present." His words carried the weight of a man forged by decades of service, survival, and reflection. But behind his calm, behind the smile that came easily to him even now, lingered the faint shadow of the boy who had once held his brother's hand in a park, a boy who had trusted too easily and vanished with a promise of candy. The reunion in the summer of 2024 did not erase the pain of 1951. It did not answer every question, nor undo the years of grief that had shaped the Albino family, but it closed a circle. It gave them something they had not known in 73 years, a living answer. And in that answer was vindication. Roger had been telling the truth all along. Antonia's faith had not been in vain. The story of Luis Albino was no longer one of disappearance, but of return. That summer, the Albino family witnessed something few ever do, a miracle decades in the making. Luis was alive. He had lived a full life, built a family of his own, and now, finally, was reunited with those who had never stopped searching. Yet beneath the celebration, another truth still lingered. The crime itself had never been solved. Luis had come home, but the questions that began in Jefferson Square Park on February 21, 1951, remained unanswered. Roger had never forgotten her, the woman in her 30s, speaking Spanish, a green scarf tied neatly over her hair. She had approached them as if she belonged there, calm and familiar, the kind of adult a child instinctively trusts. She spoke to them kindly. She promised candy. And then, she was gone, with Luis. That single image had haunted Roger's mind for 73 years, and yet, back then, the police had dismissed it almost immediately. No sketch was made, no neighborhood canvass for witnesses, no follow-up on anyone matching her description. Instead, investigators had clung to the drowning theory, searching the bay while the real trail slipped away forever. Now, with Luis alive, Roger's account was vindicated. He had been right from the start. But vindication was not identification. The woman remained a ghost. Her name, her motive, her connection to the Albino family all lost to time. Who was she? Did she know them? Or was she a stranger passing through Oakland that winter afternoon? Did she act alone? Or was she just one link in a larger chain? Even without a name, the question burned. Why him? Some believed it was random, an impulsive act by a woman desperate for a child of her own. Others suspected something far darker. In mid-century America, black market adoptions were not unheard of, especially among poor or immigrant families whose voices held little power in the system. If Luis had been swept into such a network, had the woman been paid to take him? Did she hand him directly to the couple who raised him? Or did he pass through other hands first? The logistics are now lost to time, blurred by silence and death. The woman is almost certainly gone. The paper trail long since destroyed. Luis's memories of his adoptive parents are warm. They raised him as their own, gave him their name, sent him to school, and treated him with love. To him, they were his family. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, he remembered the small inconsistencies, the vague answers, the evasive smiles whenever he asked about his early childhood. Something had always been missing. The obvious question, the one that lingers even after the miracle, is whether they knew. Did the couple who raised Luis understand that he had been stolen from another family? Or were they themselves deceived, told he was an orphan, a child given up willingly, with no paperwork, no witnesses, and no truth behind the story. The real answer died with them. They passed away years before the DNA revelation, carrying their secrets to the grave. But one of the most painful unresolved questions isn't about the kidnappers at all. It's about the people who were supposed to protect the Albino family. Why had the Oakland police been so quick to dismiss Roger's account? Why had they clung to the theory of drowning with no body, no clothing, no evidence of any kind? The albinos had felt the sting of discrimination. Antonia, a single Puerto Rican mother with limited English, was not seen as credible. Her 10-year-old son was treated as unreliable. Their words, their pleas, their pain were not heard. And so the trail grew cold. It's impossible not to wonder. If the police had acted differently, if they had canvassed the neighborhood, issued alerts, or followed Roger's lead, could Luis have been found before he was taken across the country? That question, perhaps, is the heaviest of all. For the Albino family, the reunion in 2024 brought healing, but not complete peace. They could now say Luis had lived. They could say he had been found, but they could not say who took him, why it happened, or how it unfolded. Those answers remained sealed behind decades of silence. Luis himself accepted that truth with quiet grace. "I can't change what happened," he told his family. "I can only live with what I have." His words carried the calm of a man who had made peace with the unknowable. But for others, especially Alita and the younger generation, the loose ends still sting. The FBI has left the case technically open, though few believe it will ever be solved. Too much time has passed. Too many of the people who might have known the truth are gone. Officially, the kidnapping of Luis Armando Albino remains unsolved. And so, the Albino family lives with both joy and uncertainty. Joy because the lost child was found, and uncertainty because the shadows remain. Who was the woman in the park? Why Luis? Did his adoptive parents know? Could it all have been stopped? Questions without answers, the kind that echo across generations. For 73 years, the albinos lived with silence, and then one simple DNA test shattered it. What do you think really happened to Luis Albino back in 1951? Was it a random act, or part of something larger? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories of long-lost mysteries finally brought to light, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next case where time, truth, and fate collide.